We often visualize the Great Wall of China as a stone dragon, a winding structure of earth and stone extending 20,921 kilometers into the Chinese countryside. It's a standing testament to ancient engineering on a global scale, the longest man-made structure in the world. But when you look at the maps, a paradox emerges. Why on earth would any civilization choose to build the largest construction projects and oldest existing fortifications on the most rugged terrain, specifically on the most impassable mountain peaks? Today, we're going to take a technical deep dive into the impossible logistics of how they actually did it. To understand the sheer scale of this project, you have to look at the geography. The wall was constructed over various steep hills and mountains, often following the very edge of a mountain ridge to maximize the defensive advantage. This wasn't a random choice. Designers took advantage of the terrain to repel invaders most effectively, turning the land itself into a weapon. Consider the verticality of the Yanshan and Yanshan mountains, where the slopes are so severe that any army would be exhausted before they even reach the base. Then there are the Daxingangling, Heilan, Minshan, and Hengduan mountains. In these regions, construction crews worked on slopes so precarious that a single slip meant a certain fall. It is staggering to realize that they didn't just build a wall, they anchored a stone barrier to the spine of the world. Now, this entire system of fortifications began not as a single project, but as a fragmented collection of walls. During the Chun-Q period, starting around the 7th century BC, individual feudal states built walls of compacted earth to shield themselves from nomadic raiders from the north. These early barriers were essentially local defenses, constructed between 771 and 476 BC during the spring and autumn period, to protect against the nomadic groups of the Eurasian steppe. By 221 BC, however, the landscape changed. Emperor Qin Shi Huang unified these states and joined together the smaller, disparate walls of his predecessors to create a massive, unified imperial system. His goal was clear: military defense, controlling trade, immigration, and communication. He needed to stop the Mongol, Turk, and Xenu invasions. While the Tibetan Plateau and the Pacific Ocean provided natural barriers, the northern mountains remained dangerously vulnerable. This effort transformed the structure into what was known as the Long Wall, stretching from Lintao in the west to Liaodong in the east. Under the Han Dynasty, between 206 BC and 220 AD, the wall expanded to 3,700 kilometers, extending from Dunhuang to the Bohai Sea. This was a necessity for protection against the pastoral nomads, known as the Xiongnu or Huns, whose animal-driven lifestyle contrasted with the settled agricultural lifestyle of the Chinese. This cycle of construction and reinforcement continued well into the 16th century AD. So why build on the most difficult terrain possible? The logic was purely strategic. By placing the wall on the narrowest, steepest ridges of the mountains, the engineers created a natural fortress. The outer side of the wall, facing north, was often a sheer cliff, making it essentially impassable for an invading army. This meant the wall itself didn't even need to be a massive barrier in some places. The mountain peak served as the first line of defense. To manage this vast distance, they integrated a system of more than 2,000 watchtowers. These wasn't just for observation, they were the internet of the ancient world. When raiders were spotted, soldiers used fire and smoke signals to communicate between towers. A signal fire lit on one peak would be seen by the next, passing a message across hundreds of miles in a few hours. The strategic height of these beacon towers allowed an army to be notified of an invading force long before they arrived at the gates. Let's look at the actual blueprints. The structure varies because the engineers designed for local conditions, using local materials to avoid transporting everything from a central hub. In the West, they relied heavily on tamped earth, also known as rammed earth, along with wood and stone. These materials were chosen because they were available on site, making the build feasible in remote regions. However, the image of the wall we recognize today comes mostly from the Ming Dynasty. After the Ming Dynasty took control in 1368, they began strengthening the walls using bricks and stones produced in local brickyards. This wasn't just for aesthetics. These sections were constructed in response to the threat of Mongol invasions, requiring a far more durable barrier than simple earth. When we examine the Ming Great Wall, the scale is staggering. These sections were 8,851 kilometers long. If you walk the length of a section, you'll find an average height of 7 meters and a width of 6 meters. To put that in perspective, at its most imposing points, you are looking at walls 20 to 30 feet high and 6 to 9 meters wide, roughly 23 to 26 feet across. This massive increase in mass, moving from rammed earth to heavy brick and stone, transformed the barrier into the architectural titan that still stands across northern China today. It is a strange realization that the outer skin of the wall is essentially a facade. When you look at those massive stone blocks, you are actually seeing a shield for a core of rubble and earth. This is where the technical utility becomes apparent. The wall wasn't just a barrier, it was a weapon. For instance, the structure featured specific openings for archers to shoot at invaders, and larger openings for throwing stones. The beauty of the restored sections is a bit of a distraction from the reality. The wall was a functional, lethal tool designed for maximum efficiency in killing. Moving these massive materials up sheer cliffs was a calculation of raw human effort. Estimates suggest that hundreds of thousands to possibly millions of workers were involved. This workforce, composed of soldiers, peasants, and prisoners, worked in a coordinated, brutal rhythm. On the most remote terrain, they didn't have cranes or pulleys. They used basic rope, wood, and basket systems to haul materials upward. In some sections, animals were used as pack animals, but the bulk of the load was moved by hand. It is a staggering realization that millions of tons of stone and earth were shifted up mountain ridges using nothing more than baskets and ropes. You have to wonder how many of those workers simply vanished into the same stone they were building, as the sheer verticality of the work sites remained the most dangerous part of the process. Beyond the engineering, there is a darker side to the construction. Forced labor continued under the patronage of Han Emperor Han Wudi, and the wall became known as a place of suffering. Local poetry and legends describe workers buried in nearby mass graves, and some accounts claim thousands of men died and were buried under the wall, effectively becoming the flesh and blood of the structure. However, the physical evidence doesn't align with the myth. While no human remains have been found inside the wall itself, burial chambers discovered nearby indicate that many workers died from accidents, starvation, and exhaustion. The legend of the workers' graves within the stone is a reflection of the psychological toll, rather than a literal architectural fact. Most people only see the polished, restored sections like Badaling, where the stone is clean and the stone steps are even. But the reality of the structure is far more fragmented. Michael Collins of the Wandering Wolf YouTube channel visited the remote areas of the wall, documenting the wild wall, the decaying, crumbling ruins that exist far off the beaten path. It is a jarring contrast. On one hand, you have a tourist landmark. On the other, you have the skeletal remains of a military outpost that is slowly being reclaimed by the mountains. Yet, for all its defensive logic, there are anomalies that challenge the entire premise of the wall. In remote areas, it is possible to climb over the wall from the outside going in, which seems like a critical failure for a fortification. Even more puzzling are the arrow slits. In some sections, these slits are found facing the inside rather than the outside. In other spots, the wall has slits facing both ways. This leads to an unsettling conclusion. The presence of inward-facing arrow slits suggests the wall may have been constructed to keep people inside, rather than keeping outsiders out. It transforms the structure from a shield into a cage, leaving us to question who the real prisoners were. Despite its immense engineering, the wall did not always provide a complete shield. In the 13th century, Genghis and Kublai Khan successfully overcame it during the Mongol invasions. Later, in 1644, the northern Manchu clans established the Qing dynasty by overthrowing the Ming, meaning China was ruled by the very people the wall was meant to keep out. Once the imperial borders extended beyond the barrier, the structure lost its purpose and fell into ruin, with compacted earth eroding and bricks being looted for local construction. It did find new utility during World War II, when China used sections for defense against the Japanese occupation. In 1987, the Ming Great Wall was designated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, covering an area of 2,151.55 hectares, or 5,316.6 acres. There is a persistent myth that the wall is the only man-made structure visible from space, but it is barely perceptible from low Earth orbit and entirely invisible from the moon. Today, over 10 million people visit annually. Yet, the story is not finished. New sections are still being discovered every few years, and up to 30% of the Great Wall remains undiscovered, hidden, or buried under the earth.